So there comes a moment, often quiet, rarely convenient, when you stop dancing around someone's dysfunction. You stop laughing at the jokes that aren't funny. You stop explaining your feelings like they're a debate. And in that moment, something powerful happens. The narcissist loses everything. Not because you raised your voice, not because you fought fire with fire, but because you did something much harder. You got honest. You named the behavior. And when you do that, when you say, this is manipulation, this is gaslighting, this is not love, you pull back the curtain and the magic trick doesn't work anymore. What once felt like chaos starts to look like strategy, and it becomes really hard to keep participating in your own confusion. So you draw a boundary, not a threat, not a warning, a boundary, a firm, grounded, this is where I end and you begin. And if they scream, cry, ghost you, or guilt trip you, that's not your burden. That's just proof the boundary was necessary. The truth is, narcissists don't fear anger. They don't fear confrontation. They fear indifference. They fear not mattering. They fear your silence when you finally realize that engaging with them only drains you. When you stop responding, they lose their power source. Because their strength was never real. It was borrowed. Borrowed from your kindness, your empathy, your need to fix things, your silence. One of the most courageous things you can do in a toxic dynamic is to name what's actually happening. It sounds simple, but it's profoundly disruptive to them and liberating for you. Narcissistic people rely heavily on ambiguity. They live in the gray areas where intention is slippery, blame is deflected, and everything is your fault. Until it isn't, and then somehow it's still your fault. They master the art of plausible deniability, subtle digs disguised as jokes, praise laced with poison, apologies that never include the word sorry. They control the narrative by never letting it become clear. But when you find the words, your words, to call out the truth, you change the entire power dynamic. When you say, this isn't a conversation, it's a performance. That's not feedback. That's control. That joke wasn't funny, it was cruel. You're not concerned, you're condescending. You're not being dramatic, you're being clear. And clarity is what narcissists fear most. They thrive in confusion because confusion keeps you disoriented. It keeps you questioning your reality, your instincts, your goodness. The more you doubt yourself, the easier it is for them to slip the leash around your neck and make you dance to their rhythm. But the moment you name the manipulation, you stop being a willing participant in their game. You step out of the fog. You hold up a mirror, not the funhouse one they hand you, but a real one. And suddenly, their behavior is no longer clever. It's no longer charming. It's just visible. And here's the hard part. They won't thank you for this clarity. They might double down. They might lash out. They might twist your words or call you unstable. That's okay. That's a sign you've touched the truth. Because the minute you name the behavior, you shift the shame off your shoulders and back where it belongs. You begin to rebuild the most important relationship you'll ever have, the one with yourself. You start trusting your gut again. You stop justifying red flags. You stop calling emotional neglect normal. You stop apologizing for noticing the tension in the room. And in this clarity, something even more powerful begins to grow, your freedom. Naming the behavior won't always fix the relationship, but it will always restore your footing. It tells your nervous system, you're not crazy, you're not too sensitive, you're paying attention. And that, more than anything else, strips a narcissist of the one thing they need to survive. Your silence, boundaries are not walls, they are not ultimatums, they are not acts of cruelty. Boundaries are the most honest form of self-respect we can practice. And for narcissists, boundaries are unbearable. Why? Because boundaries clarify where you end and they begin. And in the narcissistic mind, there is no true separation. You are not seen as your own person with your own needs, values, and voice. You are an extension of them, a reflection, a source of supply, a supporting character in the movie of their life. So when you place a boundary, when you say, it's not okay, or I need time to think, or simply no, you're not just limiting their access to you, you're confronting the false reality they've built. You're threatening the illusion of control. And narcissists don't react well to losing control. They may test your boundary instantly, dismiss it, mock it, violate it in subtle ways to see if you're serious. They'll tell you you're overreacting, that you've changed, that you're being selfish, dramatic, cold. And if you've been conditioned to prioritize peace over truth, that pushback can feel overwhelming. But here's the secret. The moment they feel your boundary is real, not a bluff, not temporary, not up for negotiation, they panic because they know they've lost access not just to your time or energy, but to your emotional compliance. You see, narcissists don't fear conflict. They don't fear arguments. What they fear is accountability. And boundaries demand accountability. Boundaries say, you don't get to call me at 2 a.m. and unload your chaos. You don't get to dictate how I feel about my own story. You don't get to harm me and call it love. And here's what most people misunderstand. Boundaries aren't just about the other person. They're about what you are no longer willing to carry. You set a boundary not to punish them, but to protect your peace, to honor your healing, to reclaim the space that was taken from you by guilt, fear, or conditioning. And maybe the scariest part of boundaries is that they reveal things we didn't want to see. When you set a boundary with a healthy person, they may be surprised, but they'll adapt. They'll listen, they'll grow. When you set a boundary with a narcissist, they'll fight. They'll guilt you. They'll twist it into an attack on them. And if they can't control you, they may discard you, not because you did anything wrong, but because you stopped being easy to manipulate. That's not a loss. That's protection. Boundaries are not cruelty, they are clarity. They don't push away love, they filter out harm. And for narcissists, that filter is unbearable because it exposes their behavior for what it is. Without access to your emotional labor, your forgiveness on demand, your people-pleasing reflexes, they are left to sit with their own emptiness. And that, more than anything else, is their greatest fear. So yes, boundaries are the narcissist kryptonite. But for you, they're your compass, your strength, your line in the sand that says, I will not abandon myself to belong to you. And that is the beginning of real, unshakable freedom. There's a moment in every toxic dynamic when you realize this isn't a disagreement, it's a setup. You're not arguing about the dishes or the tone of your voice or who said what last weekend. You're trapped in a loop, one carefully designed to keep you off balance, over-explaining, and emotionally drained. Narcissists don't want resolution, they want reaction. They want you to get flustered. They want to poke and prod until you break down and defend yourself, because in that moment, when you're hurt, loud, and emotionally spinning, they can point and say, See, you're the problem. It's bait. And once you see it for what it is, you realize the most powerful move isn't to fight harder or explain better. It's to not play the game at all. Refusing to engage breaks the cycle. Because without your energy, your reactions, your justifications, their pattern begins to collapse. You see, narcissists don't thrive on silence. They thrive on drama. They thrive on conflict that keeps the spotlight on them. When you go quiet, not out of fear or passivity, but out of clarity, they lose their power source. You're no longer dancing to their rhythm. You're no longer volunteering to be emotionally hijacked every time they feel bored, insecure, or threatened. This doesn't mean you become cold or indifferent. It means you become discerning. You stop trying to prove your worth to someone who's committed to misunderstanding you. You stop chasing closure from someone who profits off your confusion. It means you learn the difference between connection and entanglement. Refusing to engage might look like not replying to a baiting text, choosing not to argue when you're being gaslit, walking away when a conversation turns toxic, saying, I'm not available for this kind of dialogue anymore. It doesn't feel powerful at first. It feels foreign. It feels unnatural, especially if you've been trained through trauma, through culture, through childhood, to believe that love means staying, fixing, and endlessly explaining. But disengagement is not abandonment, it's not punishment, it's protection. You're not shutting down, you're opting out of emotional chaos. And here's the deeper truth. When you refuse to engage, you're not just breaking the cycle with them. You're breaking it inside yourself. You're unlearning the belief that you have to earn peace by suffering first. You're reprogramming your nervous system to recognize safety not as silence after the storm, but as the absence of the storm entirely. Because the more you engage, the deeper you get pulled into the dysfunction, you lose sight of your center, your voice, your values. But when you pause, when you breathe, when you refuse the invitation to chaos, you regain the most sacred thing narcissists hope you'll forget, your inner authority. You begin to trust yourself again. You stop waiting for them to validate your reality. You realize you never needed permission to leave the loop. So yes, refusing to engage might feel small. It might feel like doing nothing. But make no mistake, it is a radical act of self-respect. It is you saying, this ends with me. It is you stepping out of the dance that's gone on too long. And that, quietly, bravely, is how you begin to heal. There is nothing more threatening to a narcissist than someone who reclaims their story, because your story, your truth, your perspective, your emotional reality is something they've tried to edit, control, and rewrite from the moment they met you. They gaslight not just to confuse you, but to replace your voice with theirs. They minimize, not just to dismiss you, but to narrate your life for you. They manipulate the storyline so they're always the hero or the wounded victim, and you're the cause of every problem. And for a long time, you might have believed them, not because you were weak, not because you were foolish, but because they made you question your own lens. They told you that your memory was off, that your feelings were too big, that your pain was a problem, and when you cried, they called it drama. When you stood up for yourself, they called it disrespect. When you pulled away, they called it betrayal. So you started editing yourself, shrinking, second-guessing, apologizing for being human. But here's the truth. Your story belongs to you. And reclaiming it piece by piece, breath by breath, is an act of revolution. Because the moment you say, that did happen, I was hurt, this wasn't okay, you start pulling your voice out from under their control. And no, it's not easy. Reclaiming your story often means sitting with uncomfortable truths, not just about them, but about what you tolerated, what you overlooked, how you abandoned parts of yourself just to survive. But that reckoning, that's where the healing begins. Because every time you tell the truth, you loosen their grip. Every time you name what they erased, you begin to remember who you were before the gaslight, before the guilt, before the story was rewritten in their favor. And you realize you are not broken. You are not too much. You are not to blame for someone else's inability to love you with decency and care. You are a person with a voice, with value, with a story worth honoring, not reshaping to fit someone else's fragile ego. Reclaiming your story means refusing to carry their shame. It means taking your narrative back from the hands of someone who used it to control you. It means moving from survival to sovereignty. It may look like journaling memories you've buried. It may look like telling your story to a trusted friend, a therapist, or even to yourself in the mirror. It may look like speaking your truth publicly, or never saying a word aloud, but knowing finally in your bones that what you experienced was real. Because when you reclaim your story, you're not just healing the past, you're rewriting your future. You're saying, my truth matters. My pain deserves compassion. My voice is enough, even if it shakes. And that kind of reclamation, it doesn't just shift your identity, it shatters the narrative they use to keep you small. Narcissists lose everything when you do this, because you are no longer someone they can narrate, distort, or define. You become someone they can no longer write into their story, because you're finally writing your own. And that, more than anything, is the most revolutionary thing you can do. One of the hardest lessons to learn, especially if you're a deeply compassionate person, is that empathy can be misused, not by you necessarily, but against you. When you're in a relationship with a narcissist, your empathy becomes the very thing they count on to keep you close. They know that if they cry, you'll comfort them. If they rage, you'll try to understand. If they hurt you, you'll try to see why they did it. And let's be honest, at first that feels like love. It feels like connection, like doing the emotional work, like choosing grace over judgment. And in healthy relationships, empathy does exactly that. It softens hard moments, it builds bridges, it invites healing. But in toxic relationships, especially with narcissists, your empathy becomes a trap. They weaponize it. They use your compassion as a shield to avoid accountability. They twist your understanding into a reason you should stay quiet, stay small, stay forgiving. They rely on your kind heart to excuse the harm they cause. And over time, you begin to feel it, the quiet erosion of self. You start to carry the weight of their emotions while dismissing your own. You comfort them after they wound you. You make space for their story, but shrink yours down to a whisper. You become fluent in their pain, but illiterate in your own. That's when the shift must happen. Empathy for yourself has to come first, because there's a line, sometimes paper thin, between compassion and self-abandonment. And when you consistently choose empathy for someone who repeatedly violates your boundaries, that line gets crossed again and again. Self-empathy says, I'm allowed to be angry. My pain matters just as much as theirs. Understanding someone's trauma does not mean I should accept their abuse. And this is important. Having empathy for yourself doesn't make you cold, selfish, or cruel. It doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop bleeding for people who keep handing you knives. It means you stop turning your emotional labor into a down payment on their potential. Because at some point, your healing will demand this question: what would it look like to treat myself with the same tenderness I give everyone else? That is empathy. That is love. That is justice. It might mean walking away, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. It might mean holding someone accountable, not to punish them, but to honor yourself. It might mean saying, I see your pain, but I will not let it be a weapon against mine. And narcissists, they can't stand this shift, because when you prioritize empathy for yourself, you stop being predictable. You stop being controllable. You stop twisting yourself into a shape that makes them comfortable. And they lose something vital, access to your compassion without cost. Choosing self-empathy is one of the most radical acts of liberation you can practice in the aftermath of emotional manipulation, because it tells your nervous system, I matter, my experience is real, I don't have to bleed to prove I'm good. So yes, empathy is a beautiful, human, necessary gift, but it is not a tool of martyrdom. It is not a reason to stay in pain, and it is not your job to be the salve for someone who won't stop cutting you. Empathy for yourself, it's survival, sovereignty. It's coming home to the one person who never deserved to be left behind, you. Here's what no one tells you. Narcissists don't just fear being exposed, they fear you waking up. Because once you wake up, once you name the behavior, set the boundary, refuse to engage, reclaim your story, and finally choose yourself over them, the game is over. Not with screaming or revenge or chaos, but with stillness, with clarity, with the sacred act of choosing your own nervous system over their emotional warfare. They lose everything when you do this, because their power was never about who they were. It was always about how much of yourself you were willing to give away. And when you stop giving them your silence, your peace, your forgiveness on demand, they're left standing in front of the mirror they've avoided for years. Meanwhile, you become something entirely different. You become someone who no longer apologizes for taking up space. Someone who trusts their own perception. Someone who walks away